All right, people are joining us now. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ellie. I'm a member of the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us for All About Bees with beekeeper Chris Layman of Fox Farm Apiary. Chris Layman is a longtime beekeeper who mentors other beekeepers in the Catskills and Hudson Valley area. He manages over 20 bee yards. He keeps honeybees at both the Catskill Center's Thorn Preserve and Olana State Historic site to teach the public about bees, other pollinators, and the plants they need to survive. He is currently studying to receive a Master Beekeeper certificate from Cornell. Now a little bit about the Woodstock Pollinator Pathway. The Woodstock Pollinator Pathway is helping to create essential habitat in our community for vital and vulnerable pollinators. We're a collaborative project of Woodstock Land Conservancy, the Catskill Center, Woodstock New York Transition, the Woodstock Environmental Commission, and community member partners. We have a few exciting events coming up that I'd like to tell you about. October 3rd, we'll have a native seed exchange at the Woodstock School of Art, along with small group tours of the pollinator planting Del Orlowski is currently installing there. And then on October 7th, we're excited to invite Doug Tallamy, nationally renowned environmentalist and New York Times best-selling author, for a virtual presentation. Before I turn over the presentation to Chris, I'd like to invite Woodstock Pollinator Pathway Committee Chair George Asher to say a few words.
Hi. I hope that some of you out there have been able to join the Pollinator Pathway by creating some pollinator habitat in your yard, or just finding some habitat that's already there. And by the way, we have now in this area over 120 people have joined by creating habitat in their yards. And if you've done this, you can buy one of these signs to show what you've done. This is a metal sign, and it says, "This property is on the pollinator pathway, native plants, pesticide free." Very attractive. You can get this by going on to our website at Woodstock, New York, pollinatorpathway.org. That is, I'm sorry, I did it wrong. Woodstock, NY, pollinatorpathway.org. And click on the button that says yard signs. And you can also join through that website. It costs $10 plus shipping. I'm going to turn it over now to Chris Layman. I hope you very much enjoy the presentation that Chris is going to give us on bees. Thank you, Chris.
Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Layman, and I'm very happy to share some of the information about our bees and pollinators and our pollinator pathways and our habitat. I've been very, very happy to be a citizen scientist for the last few years for the BioBliss at the Thorn Preserve, and learned quite a bit about not just the honeybees that I bring there, but since it's been growing in, all the other pollinators that are living there now. So this first slide is a picture of the Macalady, and this is the leafcutter bee on some red clover. And before I get into them, I'd like to show you the next slide. There's a couple of interesting slides I have on Google Earth. So next slide, please. This is the Thorn Preserve in about approximately a square mile area. And this is taken in 1993, and it's a black and white photo. But I have 3 different shots here to show you before this became a major pollinator hub. But you can see that there's some houses, there's some roads, and there's a couple, the Sawkill down at your bottom right is quite wide. And with the next slide, this is in 2009. So you can see the colors change, but you can see that the roads are starting to shrink a little bit. You can see that there's a canopy over some of the roads. And on the third one, which is in 2019, you can see that the canopy is closed up in a lot of areas, and in the lower right, especially over the Sawkill, that the trees have definitely been encroaching. And when we think about habitat, when we think about the habitat for the bees and pollinators, we usually use a reference of somewhere out west, where we see just miles and miles of cornfields where the hedgerows have been taken away, and there's just a nutritive desert out there. And we don't often think of where we live, which is a great area, heavily forested though, so an ever slowly shrinking habitat for bees and pollinators. And so in the middle here, you see this large thorn preserve, and it's only been about 6 years that the thorn preserve has been able to grow in a little bit. And prior to growing in, it was a hay field, and before that, there was some corn grown there. And my early Google Map photos of the area showed just closely mowed, sun-beaten, dry, probably not a lot of life in between in the summer months because of the mowing. But now has become the largest pollinator hub in the area. So it's a really great to be a part of that. And with our pollinator pathways, we're creating some nesting at all corners, which I'm going to go into a little later. The pollination habitat has been growing there, and the population of some of the solitary bees and social insects that live there have increased as well. So I'd like to start with the next slide and show you some of them. This is the thorn preserve just a few years ago, and this was earlier in the season before everything was growing in, but it's a beautiful spot. You have Overlook Mountain in the background. It's approximately 60 acres, and it has really fine mowing paths for people to enjoy, and through most parts of the year when you're walking there, you can see life happening all around you. Next slide, please. So this is just a little, at the very far corner of the thorn preserve. I've been keeping honeybees for, this is the 6th season out there. So it's been a really great platform to teach the public about bees, and there's not many places where you're able to observe honeybees in their habitat, and this is a great opportunity. Next slide, please. So we're going to start this talk with the solitary insects that live at the thorn, the solitary bees. There are solitary bees and there are social bees. And we're going to start with the solitary ones. And this is Megachelidae. These are the leafcutter bees, and this is on spotted knapweed at the Thorn Preserve. And this was taken last year. And the leafcutters are a very interesting species. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the Megacheilia lagapoda. And very beautiful. This is on Echinacea at the Thorn Preserve. These are sometimes ground nesting bees, but some of these pollinator nests that we've been putting up with some tubes in them have been able to house leafcutters. We're trying to attract mason bees and leafcutter bees. They're both in the same genus. Next slide, please. Okay, here's another picture of the lagapoda. Now, if you didn't know much about bees, that when you see this on a flower, you might mistake this for a honeybee. They're only very similar in size. But what's different about these and the honeybees, first of all, these are solitary, and the honeybees are a social insect. But the way they collect pollen is different than the honeybees. When this leaf cutter flies to a flower, it's creating a positive electric charge, a static electric charge. So when it grounds itself on a plant, you can see on the bottom of its abdomen there, those yellow brushes. And they don't collect pollen on their back legs. They collect pollen on these brushes to bring home to their young. And what's just different than honeybees, the leaf cutter is going to bring them back to a hollow tube. It makes its nests out of leaves, raspberry leaves and some other ones, and makes nesting material from that. She's going to bring all these provisions into a small area, all the way in the back. She starts all the way in the back. And she's going to lay an egg on top of a pile of pollen and nectar. And then she's going to seal that off and begin again. And usually, depending on the length of the tube that they're in, she can lay 4 or 5 eggs within that tube. And these eggs will eventually, of course, hatch. And the difference between the solitary bees and social bees is that this bee is going to mature and not come back out till spring. So the eggs that are being laid now, the only thing that overwinters is a mated female in this species. And many of the other solitaries are the same way and differ from the honeybees, where they stay together as a whole superorganism, as a colony over the winter. These solitary bees will just burrow and nest for the year and then emerge into spring and begin again. Next slide, please. This is the little bee house that we have at the Thorn Preserve. And I've been checking it regularly, and you see a lot of nesting material go in there. I did just check a few days ago, and there's not too many left because this time of year they are in their mating, and they are going to be getting ready to. You're probably not going to see too many of the leaf cutters out now. The remaining ones were getting provisions for the winter. Next slide, please. Okay, this is one of the mining bees. And it's another bee that if you're not really familiar with bees, that at a glance, this could seem like a honeybee. But this is an early spring pollinator, and this is one of the ground burrowers. And what's really interesting about the mining bees, and understand the relationship between some of the native plants and some of the native pollinators, is that this native pollinator only feeds on pussy willow. And then she's going to lay several eggs in a line, likely in the ground, in very soft ground. And they're going to stay in a watertight cocoon until next spring. They're going to hibernate for the whole year. But very interesting that they only feed on this one plant. So we need these plants. Pussy willow is usually found in wetlands, and is very important, and I would definitely include this in your list of pollinator plants for this bee especially. And this is one of the ground burrowers. It lives in the ground. Next slide, please. This is the mining bee when it's in the ground, and it's a beautiful little bee. So one of the suggestions I'm going to make is in your garden, have a small area that's either outside the garden or within the middle of the garden, small oval mounds that you can make with some dirt and some sawdust, and maybe a little mulch on top so it doesn't grow a lot of extra weeds, but allow the habitat for these. And if you have the pussy willows nearby, then you can observe this, and it could be a great experience for you. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a very interesting photo. On the bottom, you can see a leafcutter nest, and this is how they do it. All those leaves are from a few different types of plants. I've seen them taken from raspberry plants mostly. And in the middle, you have resin bees, and you can see that there's shallower nests, and there's a larvae in each one. So it looks like there's about 8 in that nest. And on the top is a mason bee. And the mason bee is in the same, they're all relatively in the same order to make a Kylie Osmia is the subspecies of this, and this is the mason bee on top. And inside that cocoon, they will develop into an adult stage, but they'll still be sealed until spring, and then they will finally hatch. And we're hoping to bring more mason bees to the Thorn Preserve. Next slide, please. This is a milkweed plant, and this bee appears to be a longhorned bee. And I haven't seen too many of them, but this was the one shot that I've had of a longhorn bee at the Thorn Preserve. Another solitary bee that will mate in the late summer and will burrow in and then reemerge in early spring to start again. Next slide, please. This is a photo of a mason bee. This is not taken at the Thorn Preserve. This is a screenshot. It is very difficult to photograph some of these bees in captivity, I mean outside of captivity. So occasionally we have to take one from a screenshot. But the mason bees have been some of the elusive ones, and the habitat is slowly getting better for them, but we need more nesting material and more places for them to overwinter. Next slide, please. Here are 2 mason bees. The one on the right is the blue orchard. Blue orchard mason bee, and the other is another type of mason bee. And these are the types that you can purchase. And there's several sources where you can purchase mason bees, which I'm going to definitely do for the spring, come in the early spring. Next slide, please. This is a photo of a wild rose, and hard to see, but some of these bees, even some of the mason bees and also some of the leaf cutters, not just the sweat bees, are very, very small. So I haven't had a positive identification on this, but this mostly resembles a resin bee or possibly a small mason bee, because some of the smallest of the mason bees are only about 3 or 4, about almost a half a centimeter long. Next slide, please. Now, dandelion growing at the Thorn is a very important plant, and we see it mostly on the path. And this is one thing I greatly appreciated at the Thorn Preserve is the mowing management. Dandelions grow for about 3 weeks in early May and provide a lot of, they're a non-native species, but they provide very essential food for the earliest pollinators for brood rearing. They're not a complete amino acid source of essential amino acids, but it does contain zinc. So it helps synthesize all of those proteins to make them most available for the bees and the other proteins that they're taking in. So dandelions, I know we've mentioned them before, but please leave your dandelions as long as you can. And then when they're just about done, you can mow your dandelions, and then the next pollinating plant will come up, likely clover or horehound as an example at the Thorn Preserve. Next slide, please. This is the Halictidae. This is commonly known as a sweat bee. And we were just talking earlier about how to capture good shots of bees, because it's very hard to, on a breezy day at the Thorn Preserve or wherever you're observing flowers, to get a really good shot of a bee. So I've been taking short videos, and this is on a plum blossom at our house in Hannacroy. And this Halictidae is the sweat bee. And these are one of the very interesting insects. They're very small, very effective pollinators, and seem to be growing in great numbers at the Thorn Preserve as well. These are one of the insects that are considered social, because they do share a space. Sometimes what they will do is have one entrance and several chambers with several different females. So it might appear like a nest of many different, the same bees living as a family, but they're just sharing the same entrance, but they still have their own egg laying, and they still have their own families, each of them. Most of these bees do not sting, and if they do, it's a very mild sting, and it would only be, they call these sweat bees because as a kid, that's how I was introduced to them, because out in the summer, they would be trying to get the salt off of your body, and that's how they, that's one of the nutrients they need. So one of the feeders that I've put up at the Thorn Preserve, I do add a little salt in them to help get their needs, the minerals that they need from the salts. Next slide, please. This is another one of the sweat bees, and this is on my very favorite plant, mountain mint. And this is at the Thorn Preserve in the pollinator garden. And there's quite a few different subspecies of the green metallic sweat bees. And this is either the Ogochlorella or Agapostamon, and both very beautiful and ground nesting bees. These are the ground nesting bees. And where I've observed these on my back porch, I have old bee boxes that I've scraped out and making sure that they're disease-free before I start, of course. And I've been using them as perfect little planters for my back porch. And I've noticed that the green sweat bees especially love just finding that little rotten corner in the back where there's a little moss. And they've nested there for a few years now in a row. I have not moved the boxes. Next slide, please. Okay, we're back to the, because this is such a beautiful bee, we have to see it twice. This was a bee that I observed on a red clover, and I had a short video of it. And at first, just at a glance before I had seen its eyes, it is a very similar shape to a honeybee. But with closer observation, you can see that this is one of the leaf cutters. It's a beautiful insect. Very valuable pollinator too. Next slide, please. And our bumblebees at the Thorn Preserve are definitely growing in population, because like I said, it's only been 6-7 years now since the thorn has been able to grow in it all. So most of the bees that you would see might be on the outer edges. And now we're seeing bumblebees throughout the whole preserve, and they are just an amazing insect. Next slide, please. And on our favorite plant, just about a month ago, the mountain mint is just a major honey plant and pollinator plant. Most of the plants that do come up and bloom sometimes only last about 2 weeks, 3 weeks at the most. And the mountain mint plant has been producing food for the pollinators for 15 weeks. So more than most of the summer, and still going, is the mountain mint plant. It gives the most. It has very shallow nectaries, so a variety of insects can visit this plant and have its benefits. And when I observe mountain mint with all the insects on it, I see a huge variety, but I don't see any fighting. I don't see any competition. There are some solitary wasps and some flies and butterflies, of course, and hummingbirds. They all visit the plant, and they don't seem to even acknowledge each other. They just come and get their food and move on. Next slide, please. And another favorite plant of mine for the bumblebees is and the other pollinators is anise hyssop. And this has been a very valuable plant. It's also a long bloomer. It's still going on my porch and in our gardens. Makes a wonderful tea. Now, at the time of year that this was taking for the bumblebees, because the bumblebees are a social insect, but they differ from the honeybees in this way. The honeybees are the only species that survive together over the winter as a superorganism. The bumblebees are a social insect, so there is a queen. And at the end of the summer, after she's laid her eggs and have her workers and everything, she raises males and females at the end, and these are the queens for next year. So as soon as the queens are born, this is a queen that's going to burrow herself in for next year. As a colony, they do not live together over the winter. The bumblebees will die. The only ones that live, as soon as the males are born, they just move on and they don't have a nest. They just go out and mate, and those are the ones that will travel the furthest from the nest. And the rest of these bumblebees will die over the winter. This bee here will burrow herself in the ground just a couple of inches and will emerge in the early spring. And she's going to emerge before most of the other pollinators. And even if it's a little cold, she has a large body and she needs to fly. What she's going to do is disengage her wings just for a short time. And she's going to work her wing muscles to build up heat inside her thorax. And then she can take her first flight and start feeding on the very first flowers, which are usually bulbs. Thank you. Next slide. This is a bumblebee nest. Bumblebee nests are very hard to move, and can be very easily disturbed. So I know there's a couple at the Thorn. The last time I found one was behind the garage building in front of the house there. And there are other nests out there. Usually they try to find like an old gopher hole or another burrowing hole somewhere. Those are the biological intrusions that they prefer to make their nests in. Next slide, please. And bumblebees love milkweed. Milkweed's a very popular plant at the Thorn Preserve. It's been really interesting to see everything grow in at the Thorn. And the milkweed seems to just more and more every year. It is in competition with several other plants. One in particular is the Canada thistle plant. And they grow side by side, and usually around mid-June and late June, they start competing with each other. But it seems like the milkweed has really gotten a strong foothold there. So there's monarchs everywhere. When you walk on the path from the parking lot towards the bees, that's where most of the milkweed is. And it's in abundance, and it's a wonderful thing to see. Next slide, please. Okay, we're back on dandelion, and now we're back to the honeybees. Now the honeybees, I've been a beekeeper now for 10 years, and these are a non-native species. And on a non-native species, remember the dandelion is from Eurasia, but it's been here so long that it's been somewhat naturalized in the area, and we're very dependent on it in early May for the early brood rearing season. Next slide, please. This is a verbena, I believe, viburnum. And this is at Olana, And this is one of those bushes that really provides a lot of nectar for a majority of the pollinators, especially the honeybees. I've really been happy to see that in some of the areas that have grown in, that these bushes have gotten a good foothold and produce a nectar in midsummer for the honeybees. Next slide, please. Okay, this is one of my favorite plants. This is buttonbush. This is a plant that I grew up with because I grew up near a pond, and always noticed that it was buzzing, but it was one of those plants that could be overlooked. But it is a really great midsummer bloomer and nectar producer for a host of pollinators, and it's also a host plant. This is a very important host plant. This is a native host plant for the Titan sphinx and the hydrangea sphinx. These are the big showy moths that'll be coming out, and very important host plant for them. Not a very easy plant to find, to buy. One of the places I would recommend is your county soil and water. Sometimes they have bare root tree sales. Catskill Native Nursery may have some. And I believe that the Trees for Tribs program at the Thorn was able to bring in some buttonbush for the riparian zone that borders the Sawkill, which I would love to see, because this is a tremendous plant, and it's wonderful to watch. It blooms most of the summer. Next slide, please. Okay, we have Queen Anne's lace. Now, Queen Anne's lace is another non-native species that's been naturalized to the area from Europe and Asia. And it seems to dominate the landscape right now at the Thorn Preserve. But it's not the best plant. This is a rare occasion that I see a honeybee collecting anything. It looks like it's collecting a little pollen at this time, but it's a rarely finicky nectar giver. So it might only produce nectar for about 15 minutes to a half hour a day. And that might be sometimes in the evening when there's foraging not happening. So I do see many of the sweat bees foraging on this plant, but rarely honeybees. But it's still a wonderful plant to have. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so for about 5 years in a row, I put myself out there to be the honeybee rescue guy, and was fortunate enough to find hives like this. This was taken, and I took this hive off of a building at the first week of October, and this is actually too late to take bees, but this was a swarm that collected on the side of a Greek revival in Leeds, New York, and built the most beautiful hive. And we had gotten there in time and were able to save the hive because it was a very healthy hive. This is what a beautiful, healthy hive looks like. Rare to see, especially late in the season. It had already been through a couple cool nights. But this was an early line of work, and I thought that you might like to see a perfect specimen of the honeybee when it's in its natural, when it's not inside a box. Thank you. Next slide, please. This is inside a tree. This is inside a tree in Rhinebeck, New York, that I took out a few years ago inside a maple tree. These are just beautiful. There's not many cavities for bees to go to when they swarm, but this was a great experience to be able to observe them and then carefully remove them. Next slide, please. And for the most part, honeybees would like to find a hollow cavity in a tree that's nice and high above the ground. Unfortunately, they're few and far between. So more often than not, because we have so many beekeepers in the area, when they swarm, they might end up in your house. And this is right at the front door of a very nice person's residence in Poughkeepsie, New York, that we removed a few years ago. But yeah, we removed bees for many years. I've learned more about disease transfer from Cornell, so I do not do this anymore. I'm free to always talk as a consultant for other people that remove bees, because this is an ongoing issue for a lot of people. But for the most part, if you have bees living in your house, it's fine. As long as you're not allergic to bees and are not at your front door. This was a unique case where they did need to be removed because you have deliveries and people coming in, and that's not a good situation. So we did remove those bees. But if they're up in your eave and if they're not bothering anybody, I would always encourage you to keep the bees in your house as long as you can. And if they need to be removed, we have people that can professionally remove them. Next slide, please. This is a picture of natural honeycomb that the wax produced by the bees. And this is very interesting to see, perfect hexagonal patterns. It takes about 7 to 10 pounds of nectar to create just a pound of this wax. So a lot of the nectar that comes in when building a nest goes right into nest building. Next slide, please. And this is pollen. This is actually bee bread. And a lot of the other pollinators make this as well. Pollen comes into the hive on the basket, the hind baskets of the bees, and is received at the entrance by a receiver bee. So the first thing they do, if there's enough pollen coming in, they don't need to take this directly into their bodies. They can pack this away. And for a later date, what they would do is pack it down with their heads, create an oxygen-free environment, and there's also a little bit of lactic acid in their saliva. And what this will do is give it a little bit of fermentation and allow it to be stored for a few months until they need it. Because pollen by itself is a very fragile substance, and it could be stolen, it could rot, it could be invaded by parasites. So this is the safest way to store the pollen into the winter if needed. There's a lot of pollen going into the hives as we speak right now. If you see any of the orange pollen baskets, there's a lot of goldenrod coming in. There's a lot of aster coming in, and we need as much as they can right now, because this is the bees that are being born are the winter bees. So they need to have a lot more fat in their bodies than the summer bees. The summer bees only live to be about 30 days. And one of the problems that we have, is a shortening life of a bee. But with enough pollen and enough nutrition going through the winter, the winter bees are going to live to be 3 to 5 months, and they will die in the spring during the spring turnover with the new bee's arrival. Next slide, please. This is a honeybee with dogwood pollen at Olana, just entering the hive, and it's a beautiful shot. Biodiversity is so important at all times of year. It's nice to see that there's multiple flowers and bushes. Some of these plants have been introduced. Some of them are native, but some of them have to be planted in order to benefit and to have an effective legacy landscaping ecology going there. Next slide, please. This is the pussy willow, and this is a very important spring plant, and it is the most beautiful. It's one of those plants that once it's done flowering, it's almost unrecognizable for the rest of the year. So if you move into a property where you just see some bushes and you don't really know what they are, wait till spring and they will be buzzing, because it's a very important, very early pollen source for the honeybees and the bumblebees and the other pollinators. And like I said, the mining bee Andrina solely feeds on the pussy willow for its life. Very important to have. Grows very well near water. Next slide, please. And again, we're on our favorite plant ever, the mountain mint. And this is a honeybee enjoying mountain mint. And even today on this cool day, there's still some remaining flowers on the mountain mint. And I think this year we're going to try to get a seed crop from the mountain mint, because it's in demand, and a lot of the nurseries that I've sent people to just don't carry it, and there's only a couple that do. Catskill Native Nursery does sell this, and I would encourage anyone out there starting their pollinator gardens to include this very important plant in their garden. It's really a great connector. It'll bring all the pollinators out, most I've ever seen. And like I said, for 15 weeks, this plant will produce. Very important. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the one plant that, can be seen as unpleasant. It's one of the considered invasives. This is the Canada thistle, and it's growing in abundance at the Thorn Preserve. However, for 2 weeks of the summer into late June into early July, it is a very valuable nectar producer. And I wouldn't recommend planting this in your pollinator garden. If this is growing in your yard, you can't play badminton or anything like that outside. You have to have some lawn space, but some of these plants are allowed to grow. They're in abundance at the Thorn Preserve, but understanding the plants is the most important thing. I can't help but see plants through a nutritional lens, and this is a very important for that time for 2 weeks. And after that, for you to pick it and mow it. One thing I did notice with the mountain mint is the mountain mint competes very well with the Canada thistle. The mountain mint rules, and it's just a wonderful plant that can compete very well, can drown them out when they're done, and continue flowering past their time. Next slide, please. This is just a honeybee on a orchid flower, which is I believe looks like a plum, and very important. Most of the fruit trees only produce nectar for a very short time, but while it's happening, it is very incredible to see, and honeybees absolutely love them while they can. Next slide, please. Okay, swarm season. Some people have given us calls, and it's a surprise to them that they have a cluster of bees on the side of their house. And we have an increased number of beekeepers in the area, and there's honeybees everywhere, including the Thorn Preserve. And occasionally, usually the first couple weeks of May and into June, all the swarming happens. And this was in a tree, actually in Athens at a restaurant, and we were able to successfully catch the queen. But this is a natural occurrence. This is how the honeybees reproduce. This is the natural way honeybees reproduce. It was a very natural occurrence and encouraged. I'm not really much in the honey business. I'd rather see honeybees swarm than be stuck in the hive and not being able to reproduce. So it's a good thing that you see swarming. It's a sign of a healthy hive, it's a sign of a healthy ecology. But you need to call somebody because in your restaurant, you may not want to have a hive right before dinner. So you want to call somebody, and we can safely remove the hive as soon as the queen is caught. It's easy to get the rest of the bees, but it can be quite dramatic while it's happening. Next slide, please. This is what a swarm would look like, a basketball shape. What the bees will do when the impulse is there is they will fly to a tree and create this cluster in the tree. And they will be up there for up to 3 days. They have enough enough nectar in their bodies and pollen to start a new hive. So they are more docile. They need to bend their abdomens to sting you. So they are likely not to sting, but can be frightening if you don't know much about bees. So there's got to be someone you can call. After possibly just a few hours or a few days, depending on the weather, there's already been scout bees that have picked out a new location for the bees to live, which is hopefully in a beautiful catalpa tree, about 15 feet up with a small hole facing south. But occasionally that doesn't happen. So they might end up in a barn, they might end up in your garage, they might end up in your eaves, but they seem to find their way into houses more often these days. Next slide, please. And it's just a beautiful occurrence. If you ever do get to witness a swarm, is to not panic, to just take the moment in and enjoy seeing what a swarm actually looks like. There's thousands of bees flying very close to each other, yet none are touching each other. And there's the sound in the air is just incredible. And if you ever witness it, don't panic. Let the bees land. Enjoy the moment. It's a wonderful moment. Next slide, please. This is at the Thorn Preserve this past spring. And there was a swarm in the tree as soon as I got there, and I tried to get it down, and instead it broke into two clusters. This is only one swarm. It was only a short time. In fact, before I got up on the ladder, the cluster that's in the upper right of your screen joined the queen, which is right next to the ladder. And then they all joined together, and I was able to catch them. Next slide, please. This is our pollinator garden at the Thorn Preserve. And you can see there's a little mountain mint, which is the light silvery leaves in the middle, and you have some black-eyed Susans, and in front of you, you have some anise hyssop. But what's really interesting is what's on the ground. It's not a very showy garden, and I know that we like to see lots of colors, but for the bees' sake, what's closer to the ground sometimes is really wonderful. Please, next slide. Monarda fistulosa. This is one of my other favorite plants. It doesn't bloom quite as long as the mountain mint, but it has a wonderful smell and attracts many pollinators, and it's another perennial. And I would love to see more of it at the Thorn. I started putting it in the garden there just a few years ago, and it's actually spread into a really nice cluster. And the only other spot is across the road is the Xena field, so I'd love to see the Thorn Preserve get more of the Monarda fistulosa. It's also known as wild bergamot bee balm. Next slide, please. And this is lupin. And this is the first year I planted lupins a couple years ago, and we've tried with seeds during some of our pollinator plantings, which don't show the success right away. It might take a couple years to see, but a lupin on the garden is a very valuable addition. I will definitely encourage anybody starting their pollinator gardens to include this, because the Carner blue butterfly, this is a host plant for the Carner blue butterfly, and this is one of the endangered ones. And I don't see, I would love to just drive around. When I drive in northern Vermont, I see lupins everywhere, but I just don't see enough of them around. And I would definitely encourage the pollinator pathways and the gardens to include these. They are definitely another bee plant, but very important for the Carner blue butterfly. Thank you. Next slide. This is horehound. This is one of the ones that we want to look a little closer to the ground. Now it's a non-native plant, but it's a very important one, and it's another one that is still blooming a little bit. Very, very close to the ground. There's 3 plants that grow close to the ground that can become unnoticed. Self-heal, dead nettle in the early spring, which provides the red pollen, and horehound through the summer. And since I mowed in the pollinator garden, once the dandelions were done, everywhere where I mowed, the next time I came was covered in horehound, and this is just a wonderful plant. Another non-native species at the Thorn, but it's one that benefits a lot of the other insects. Some of the native insects need their native plant to feed on, but this is the one that many of them can feed on. It's just not a host plant. Next slide, please. And this is another non-native plant that I would encourage you to have in your garden for a variety of reasons. This is borage. It's native to Assyria in the Mediterranean. And wonderful, wonderful plant, blooms all through the summer, attracts a variety of pollinators. Hummingbirds, bumblebees love it, honeybees love it, and we can eat the flowers and we can eat the leaves. It's a very nutritious plant. Very valuable to have. It's not invasive. It can grow, but it's an annual. And I would encourage you to take a second look at some of the non-native species, because we have a different world now. We have insects and insects, including the honeybees, that aren't native, and sometimes they need their plants. But it's not a plant that discriminates at all. Everyone loves this plant. That's an insect. Next slide, please. And I didn't want to go into glyphosates much, but if you ever encounter an orchard that's too lazy to mow between the trees and are using glyphosates, I would say that that's the wrong way to go. This is, I'm not going to say where this is, but didn't want to go into glyphosates, except that people are still using this irresponsibly, not far from us. And I would love to reach out to these people and just ask them if they cannot use glyphosates below their apple trees. This affects everyone, pollinators, anyone that's feeding on apples, anyone that's in the area can be exposed to this. Thank you very much. Next slide. So this has been some shots of our pollinator plantings over the years, and we started 3 years ago, and this was the very first one. And a nice group of people came out. This is a great way to connect with community. And we all got our hands dirty and we began our pollinator garden. Next slide, please. I also do some mentoring. A very important part of what I do is there's a lot of beekeepers, a lot of interested people that want to be involved in beekeeping and learn about the pollinators. And I've been very fortunate to be a teacher for many of them. Very appreciative of that. Next slide, please. And just in more mentoring in our new nucleus yard, which is a smaller hives to overwinter, doing some requeening. Next slide, please. BioBlitz, which I've really loved the experience. Meet a lot of great people, very interested, and we get to share our experiences and what we've learned. And there's a variety of subjects that come up. There's a lot that lives here at the Thorn Preserve, and I've been really fortunate to be part of the beekeeping and pollinating end of it. Next slide, please. And just another time, what I like about BioBlitz is we don't do it at the same time every year. We've done it in May, we've done it in July, we've done it in June, we've done it in September, and this was the September meeting. And it's important to see all stages of development through the thorn through the year so that we understand the ecology of the thorn and how special it is. Next slide, please. This was, I believe, my first or second one out there, and we have a great group of people. Some of the people had never seen bees up close before, and great platform to share that. If you were ever at the Thorn Preserve, you notice that we're off to this side of the bees. You don't want to be in the flight path in front of the hives. You want to observe from the side, and you usually won't get stung. But if you stand in front of the hives, there's a chance that you might get one caught in your hair or in your clothes, and then you start doing a little dance, and that could result in a sting. And we're trying to avoid that. The honeybee will die, you'll get stung, and so next slide, please. And a beautiful day we had at our last pollinator planting, which was year 2, and we'd already established some plants in the front, and we've added quite a bit, and this is before all the fencing went in, and it's grown in so much since then. But it was a great experience to have everyone come, and very grateful for that. This is the best thing we can do. This is what we need to do in our own yards, and I'd be happy to volunteer a couple of times a year to start new pollinator gardens and other people's properties. It's a great experience. Next slide, please. And I'm going to end it with a beautiful butterfly in the Canada thistle at the Thorn Preserve, and I would love to take your questions.
Hello.
Hello.
So let's see, I do have one question here. Let me search the question and answer box. Marietta asks, are there any particular spring bulbs to help support the bumblebee?
Crocus.
Pardon?
Crocus.
Crocus.
And you can plant that now.
Okay.
Daffodils, but crocus would be a really great pollen producer for them. They will visit it.
Thank you. Nancy asks, how do you remove that large hive from the column?
Well, fortunately, I was able to be on a lift. I had to be on a lift for that, a scaffolding lift. So it had to be a 2-person operation. It was someone on the ground that lifted me up to the hive, and I brought a Langstroth hive with me. What I would do is trim down the brood comb into perfect rectangles that fit into the frames and rubber band them with the most brood in there. And then the rest of the bees, once I catch the queen, the rest of the bees will enter the hive. And we were able to overwinter that one. That was a rare occurrence because it was such a strong hive. It's usually not a good idea to wait so long in the season, but that was an exception that we were able to save that hive.
Yes, because Nancy also asked, do the bees survive the removal?
They did.
Yep. And Judith asks, I don't have hives, but panicle hydrangea was crazy with bees about a month ago. Looked like honeybees. Where do they live? How far do they range?
Okay. Depending on where she is, I mean, the bees will fly up to at least 5 miles to find plants. They're one of the bees that can. Most of these other pollinators will only fly about within their area, no more than 200 meters. But the honeybee, if needed, will fly as far as 5, even farther to 8 miles to get food.
Wonderful. Thank you. Megan asks, what are your top 5 plants you would recommend for the backyard gardener to support pollinators? Let me get my pen.
Great question. Well, I would definitely include the lupins. The lupins would be one of the most important. Of course, the mountain mint, anise hyssop, obedient plant, and I would include evening primrose in there if it's not naturally growing, because especially we need the plants that produce nectar and pollen later in the season. Once the trees, because we have plenty of trees, and that's where we're just a little out of balance here with our food and forage, is that we get a lot of early stuff. We have a lot, our beautiful linden trees and our locust trees and our red maples and everything. They produce pollen and nectar early on in the season. But usually around the middle of July, that's all ended and we're more dependent on what's on the ground. So if we're going to start planting, we need to start thinking about what offers the most for the pollinators and bees in August, September through October. And if you have any option to, if we can get more asters growing, that would be great. Asters are growing naturally right now, but it seems like we can have more of them, especially the larger New England asters.
Got it. Thank you. Before I forget, I'm going to type into the chat. Is Georgia going to mention how people can get in touch with you?
Yes, please. You can call me directly or text me directly, but my 845-750-1652, and you can foxstonework@gmail.com. You can contact me directly as well.
What'd you say, stonework?
Fox Stonework, FOX.
At Gmail.
At Gmail.
Thank you. Now we'll go back to the questions. You made a dangerous offer there, which I bet you people are going to.
I'm going to change my number. Are you telling me? No, I really appreciate the input. And one thing that people need is direct contact with some people, cooperative extension perhaps, but I could do that for now because these answers need to be, these questions need to be answered right away because we're in the fall right now and there's things that we can do right now that could benefit us in the spring.
Yeah.
And it's stonework. It's not stoneworks. I got just to answer Judith. It's foxstonework@gmail.
If someone could write that in the chat, that'd be great because I'm focusing on the questions here. And I typed it in wrong when I typed it in. So
one thing I did want to mention, some winter workshops, because at the Thorn Preserve, we have no shortage of trees falling down right now. So we have a little bit of wood to work with. And what I'm going to propose at the Thorn Preserve this winter, and I would love some volunteers, and you can do this at home as well if you have some pieces of wood, but you can drill some holes in the side, not in the face of the wood, in your wood pile. And this can help encourage mason bees and leaf cutters and other types of bees to house in there, because right now we're starting to build up our habitat at the Thorn Preserve, but there's not enough places for them to live. A lot of the leaf cutters and ground dwellers are not going to be able to find exactly what they need, and we may be able to aid them a little bit to increase their numbers. And the same thing goes for our mowing practices. one of the things I did want to mention about mowing, I've definitely decreased my mowing by 60–70% at least on my own property. And the benefits have been just every day you're walking out and you're seeing whatever's growing and you're seeing the land buzzing. So they're very important. And you can put off maybe raking your leaves till spring. I know that there's some leaves in your yard. You can just push them off to the area where your future pollinator garden is going to be. If you haven't started your pollinator garden already, you can take a thin strip, maybe about 20 feet wide along the tree line. And also I did want to mention that with your neighbors, sometimes there might just be a fence between the both of you. And this might be a more friendly border and boundary to have, that maybe you and your neighbor can share a pollinator garden, and that's your border. It's a much friendlier border. It's also another nice way to meet your neighbor that you may have not met. Get another pollinator pathway going.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anonymous asks, which of the pollinator plants would thrive in a quite shady spot?
Well, I found that where I have the bees at the Thorn Preserve, the mountain mint is in the shade for the most part, and that does not seem to affect its growth at all. I would definitely start with that plant.
Great, thank you. Eileen asks, I didn't hear you mention Joe Pye weed. Would that be a good plant to include in a pollinator garden?
Absolutely. It's a wonderful plant. It's also a host plant. It does grow naturally around, and I'd actually like to see some more at the Thorn. I did try to plant some years ago, and I would like to do that again. It's best to have dug plants replaced, as long as there's no jump worms in them, of course, because it's very hard to start from seed. But once it gets established, I know it'll be a great addition to the Thorn. Joe Pyeweed is a major nectar honey plant in August for many of the bees.
Great question.
In the boneset family.
Judith asks, not clear how to best support solitary bees.
Okay. Well, if you have the thing for solitary bees is the non-disturbance of certain areas. If you have a lawn and you need to be in every corner of it, it's not going to be very friendly to the pollinators. So you need to create some little buffer zones where you're not going to be walking, where you're not going to be mowing, and provide that habitat for them. If you have boxes that you just wanted to put your plants in for some of the people that might live in a city or in some suburban areas in their porches, that a lot of those solitary pollinators will actually come into the boxes and live like they do here. Just leave them a little hole in the bottom and they will find a way right into the dirt, and it's a safe place for them.
Well, thank you very much. It's 9:59 and I am going to close the question and answer session and pass it on over to whoever is going to conclude. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Or perhaps I will be the one to say goodnight. Oh no, here's Ellie.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. Just to let you all know, the video of this presentation will be available tomorrow on the Pollinator Pathways website, and it will be emailed. The link will be emailed directly to everyone who registered for the webinar. I just want to say another thank you for attending tonight. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out via our website, woodstocknypollinatorpathway.org. You can reach us, our email is listed there, or you can reach us at woodstocknypollinatorpathway@gmail.com. Thanks again. Have a great evening.